Hey, everybody, this is Vegan Theology, episode 39, with Kevin and Sarah Hale.
Yes, and we are very excited for you to hear our first ever Vegan Theology interview. Dr. Andrew Remington Rillera so graciously and generously agreed to sit with us and give us a chunk of his time and let us interview him on the book that we've been working through,
Yeah.
Lamb of the Free.
Yeah, it was really nice. It was really nice of him and very generous. Obviously, he's a professor and writing other books, and he's very thoughtful, and I think he's just got a good pastoral heart. I think that's pretty clear. And I think he had a lot of good things to say about even our endeavor, but everything we were discussing about his book. And we had several questions. We just ran out of time, but we had several questions that we just never got to. And so, I don't know, maybe sometime in the future, next year or something, maybe he'll give us another interview. But we just want to let our listeners know that we had many more questions to go for, and we just ran out of time. So I think the next episode, before we embark on newer topics, we might just want to have an episode devoted to maybe responding to some of the things that Dr. Rillera said, or just discuss them. So
Yeah.
I think he brought up a lot of great points, and I think there are some things that, we could have said in response to him, but we just didn't have the time during the interview. So anyway.
Yeah, it's definitely a worthy conversation to have, to reflect on this interview.
Right.
So many things that he did bring up that we're still thinking about, working through, and
Right.
I think it'll be a good discussion.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Rillera, for the interview. We do appreciate it.
Yeah, so we hope you enjoy this awesome interview with Dr. Rillera.
All right, later. Oh, and also, when we were going back and listening to the interview, when I introduced Dr. Rillera, I was pretty amped up. And I think both of us were. It was pretty funny. We're like, who's that guy? So anyway.
You're going to notice a qualitative difference
Yeah.
in our voices,
So,
I think. Yeah.
I think we just got nervous.
We were so nervous. We just wanted it to go well.
Yeah.
And
anyway, we calmed down. But it's pretty funny. All right.
all right.
Later. Enjoy.
Enjoy.
Hello, everyone. This is Vegan Theology. We are thrilled to have a special guest joining us today for our very first interview. As many are aware, we have been working through the book Lamb of the Free by Dr. Andrew Rillera. Dr. Rillera is here with us today. Dr. Rillera is an assistant professor of biblical studies and theology at the King's University in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. He holds a PhD in New Testament from Duke University and has studied with Douglas Campbell. He is the co-author with Preston Sprinkle of a book entitled Nonviolence, The Revolutionary Way of Jesus. Dr. Rillera, welcome to Vegan Theology. We're happy you're here.
Thank you. I appreciate the invite. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely.
Yes, it's definitely not lost on us that, the end of August is a very busy time for a college professor, and your time is so valuable. So thank you so much for giving us your time. And congratulations on an amazing book.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
It's definitely been eye-opening. I feel like you've taken me on a journey I didn't realize I needed to go on. And what I love about it is it's very rigorous and academic and challenging, but at the same time, you manage to be able to inspire your reader to actually love God even more and love Jesus even more. So that's definitely something that is a goal of our podcast, is to be rigorous theologically, but not be so dry and just cerebral, and also be something that inspires people to love God even more. So thank you so much.
I'm so delighted, honored to hear that. I mean, because as your first solo book, right? And I've written numerous things over the years. Sorry, not like academic things. I mean, like when I'm applying to the jobs and that I got, and like your teaching philosophy and how do you want all these visions, right? And then so I've written the academic articles and the peer-reviewed stuff in specialized journals, and to then say oh, well, I want to bridge, why do you want to go to school? Or when you're writing a PhD application, what are your aspirations? And to say well, I want to be able to make a contribution to scholarship, right? And do that, but also in a way that's accessible to non-scholars at the same time, not to do one here and then do a different one this way, but to try to do it in the same thing. And to hear that that's working for that book in particular, it's great to hear that it's hitting that, but then also makes me want to quit. Be like, all right, I don't know if the next one will be that. Will be that.
Yeah.
We'll do that. Maybe I will just keep my audiences distinct there, something like that. But I'm glad that this book, as I pitched it, would kind of hit those two sorts of audiences, so to speak. I am almost intimidated by it. It feels like an accident. I have good editors. My editor at Cascade, Robin Perry's excellent, and yeah.
I think it's clear that God is in it. And I mean, you clearly are gifted, and I think God is definitely working within your writing. So
yeah, absolutely. And I was just going to say with that, obviously I've read some reviews, a lot of great reviews. I think mind blowing, mind expanding. I know that's true for me. It's true for both of us, but like there's so much in it. And it's just hard to do justice to it in like a small, short podcast like this. In our other episodes, we're going through it in more detail, but I don't know, in a nutshell, if it's possible to give us your thesis of this book. How do you view it?
So thankfully, this is how I was instructed to write the back cover. So it's basically the back cover is like the thesis in a nutshell, but instead of reading that whole thing, it's like the last, what is it here? Two sentences of that back cover. So what I'm trying to show in the book is that the sacrificial imagery in the New Testament is aimed at grounding the exhortation for the audience, so the readers, us, whoever, first readers, all the subsequent, as it gets passed on, for the reader, for the audience to be conformed to the cruciform image of Jesus by sharing in his death. So I don't just want to explain the sacrificial imagery in terms of like a historical, literary account in terms of like, well, this matches to this, matches to that. It's this analogy, it's not that. But really to like, how's it functioning in the mind of why are they activating this imagery? What's its use for those who are following Jesus? What's its use in proclaiming the significance of Jesus? And I think the aim of that, the ultimate goal for the apostles and or their co-workers, because some of these texts aren't written by the apostles in particular, like Luke and anyways, yeah. But it's to get at the saving significance of Jesus. That's not just things to be believed or disbelieved, but an actual transformation of ourselves, of our life, of our soul, of whatever language we want to use today to talk about the shape and character of our life, and not just as individuals, but as a community that is anchored around the crucified one. And so that the last sentence there in the back cover, so I read the second to last sentence, the last sentence there is the consistent message throughout the entire New Testament is not that Jesus died instead of us. Rather, Jesus dies ahead of us so that we can unite with him and be conformed to the image of his death. So again, what I'm trying to do then with the sacrificial imagery is first say, hey, this is only one. There's several other ways the New Testament authors convey the saving significance of Jesus, let alone his death. But also that imagery in particular is still nested within a context of union and participation and solidarity that sees Jesus and the cross not as something we're avoiding or escaping, but as something that has profound implications for how we live now, today, and with one another, and to see ourselves as creatures among other creatures and proclaiming the goodness of God as we await the full restoration of all things. So
right.
Yeah, that's the thesis in a bigger nutshell. But if you want the nutshell, read the back cover in the last two sentences. There's a nutshell. Yeah, I can't help myself but expand on it.
Yeah, it's a powerful thesis.
You spend the first half of the book helping us understand how we've just utterly misunderstood what Old Testament animal sacrifice was about, and then how that has such huge implications on how we view the character of God and how we view salvation, how we view justice. So yeah, I'm just so thankful for this book. We'll definitely talk more about the book, but just so that we and our listeners can kind of get to know you as a person, can you tell us a little bit about your story, your spiritual journey, your call to be a teacher?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up as a Jehovah's Witness in Southern California. So lived there until I was 28, going to North Carolina, so cross country. And at that point, wife and I had two kids. Yeah. So I was 28, I believe. So Southern California for most of that time, grew up Jehovah's Witness and try to summarize this as quickly as possible with some pertinent details. So my parents were divorced. I was about 4, and then my mom's, this backstory matters a little bit, or back tidbits. She grew up. She was adopted from birth into a Reformed Jewish household. Was bat mitzvahed, the whole bit. Converted to Jehovah's Witness in her early 20s, and raised 2 my older brothers, half brothers, and so they were Jehovah's Witnesses longer than I was. She converted, got divorced, married my dad as Jehovah's Witness together. So I was born, raised Jehovah's Witness, but she's always been, since that time, like very curious, very studious. And so she figured out. So there's lots of issues theologically with Jehovah's Witnesses. And at that point, being a mother of 3 and being like, well, my sons, are all raised in this. Her and my dad got a divorce, like I said. My dad's still a Jehovah's Witness to this day, and much of my family on that side. And so for me, growing up in that and having a mom who's, well, now she has 2 degrees in theology, bachelor's and a master's. But before that, she was just, naturally curious. And so we would talk about theological stuff all the time. And so for me, I had to sort out, well, my dad, my mom, both talking about the Bible, wildly different conclusions. Unfortunately, my older brothers have kind of that like numbed them to anything. And they're just kind of, meh about theology, religion, etc. Although one of them's a bit more open nowadays. So we'll see. Okay, so for me, though, that shaped me, obviously, just divorce, like all those things are very influential. But for me, it was just this, I was confronted earlier on with, you can be sincerely wrong, right? People can read the same text and obviously something's different here, right? So it's kind of this idea that some folks don't get introduced to till much later, and they attach like bad motives or something, like, oh, they're only interpreting this for these reasons because they want to justify this, that, or the other thing. It's like, no, if you like, not really. Sometimes just how we're formed to see things will lead to different interpretations. So how can I get at what these texts mean, like just all those things were like forced upon me. Like, I didn't really choose it. I guess I could have. I don't know how you respond to different environments, but for me, having those 2 options, I guess just the way I'm wired, just curious as well. And so I just read the Bible a lot as a young boy, and my mom and I would be having these discussions. I'd be reading theology textbooks and stuff like that.
Wow.
Nowadays, ones I would never suggest to other people, but people want to know. It's like Charles Ryrie things and Wayne Grudem stuff. But anyways, it got me into the text and it got me curious. And so I left Jehovah's Witnesses, and that was really rough for me in middle school. It was a long process. Talked with Jehovah's Witness elders and go through my questions and different things about their theology. And so anyways, this is longer than I meant to do. But so I grew up in Southern California, which is where Francis Chan, before he was like a known figure in evangelical circles, and now he's not as in those like conference thingies going on. But so we were at Francis Chan's church. If you Google him, if you don't know who he is, you will easily when you Google things. But before, he was like a mega church or anything like that. So it's a small little thing. And being there, that church then started a Bible college. So Francis Chan wanted to start a Bible college because seminary is so expensive. All these folks are going into debt to be trained and stuff. And this is a weird community of like, they're complementarian, maybe not not quite. But my mom was gifted, and they knew she was gifted. And Francis, like had her as his research assistant, not like a secretary, but like handling a lot of the emails he'd get with theological questions and stuff. And it wouldn't come like, it would be her writing. She wasn't like writing for him or anything like that. Like he was like, no, she knows, like you can trust what she's given you, and answering these things. So with that starting of the college, she was hired on to work there. So I got to go there for free when it was starting, and it was not accredited at the time. And I was one of the first, along with some others, that got us into master's programs to validate the degree as what you need for accreditation. Is like, are your graduates getting into master's programs? So and I went there. So started from the bottom. So, from literally just couple of people starting a Bible college. Then we educated well, learned Greek
Yeah.
and stuff, and
Yeah.
we were just reading a lot of Bible. Like we knew the Bible. That was we were going through the Bible. I think our curriculum was like you go through it like 3 times in different ways, like survey and then in blocks and
Right.
focus studies and stuff. And yes, that was really formative for me. And there I met Samir Yadav, who is now teaching at Baylor, and he had and still has great impact on me and is a continuing mentor. So from him, navigated my master's programs. I ended up going to Fuller and getting then mentored by a whole bunch of great folks there from Tommy Givens, Joel Green, and Marianne Thompson, Aaron Defoe Hunter, just a bunch of great people who really helped me work out these issues and questions. And so it just kind of just kept snowballing, right? And there's sorry, again, way longer than I wanted, but yeah. So after I was in ministry in various capacities, doing children's ministry, then doing high school and being a college director, and it ended up where, for theological reasons that then bubbled up in the Trump era, I was getting pushed out, going from full time to 10 hours. And just kind of slowly, this wasn't gonna work out there. So I had like a whole plan of like, I'm gonna be pastor there. I'll keep going to Florida for a PhD. But weirdly, there's money. This is so backwards in the way people think of PhDs because they don't give you like any money, even if you get into a funded program for a stipend. But like that was my financial rescue for our family, is getting into a funded program at Duke. And then the living in North Carolina, which is cost of living is a lot cheaper. So then I went there and I was like, we'll see what happens next. Now I'm professor, but I'm at a school, great school that really prioritizes the student teacher and relational aspect. So I don't know if I could have written a book like this at there's not many institutions that would be hospitable to that sort of thing, both from what I'm saying theologically, but then also the way I'm able to bring these things into the classroom and have mentorship and discipleship relationships with my students. My professorship is very much a ministry for me and for the school. And so, yeah, I kind of gave more of an academic history there. But for me, I guess coming from Jehovah's Witnesses, I don't have a classic I came to Jesus moment because being in how I grew up, I was just always sure of God's presence. I was always sure of God's speaking to me and in and through the scriptures, and that the living presence of Christ. And I was just gaining more and more clarity about that reality as I would investigate the scriptures, right? So it wasn't really in like, yeah, I changed some opinions at certain times, but there was never really a like boom kind of moment. It was just kind of I look back and I'm like, I need to tell my dad I'm not a Jehovah's Witness. I needed to talk to the elders about this, like, because it's the Jesus I know isn't what they're proclaiming.
Wow.
So, and that was mediated through my study of the scriptures. So it's just being constantly pulled by Christ in various directions that I kind of sometimes making a virtue out of necessity, to put it in non-theological terms, like forces both financial and external, kind of pushing us in various directions and closing off certain things, and seeing in there a pathway to keep doing what I'm doing and being curious and being able to bring that to other people who are just as curious and just as confused and just as excited about discovering the truth of God as it's revealed in Christ. So yeah, there's a little bit of both, I guess, and very, very long.
What an interesting story.
Yeah. And we love your on your description on X, where you say you're a former Jehovah's Witness and former evangelical. So it's pretty funny. So but something you said there, and I mean, this kind of gets into what we want to get into here, your book, Lamb of the Free, amazing book. I know you studied your dissertation was related to Paul. I think I was listening to one YouTube guy interviewing you. He called you a Pauline scholar. Yeah. How did you get onto this? How did you get into the essence of dismantling penal substitutionary atonement, basically the thesis of Lamb of the Free and this concept of participatory, I guess, salvation, however you want to say it. But yeah, how did you get a handle on this?
So Yeah, it's a blessing and a curse. I'm curious about a lot of things, and it depends how far I get into that hyper focus mode, right? Of what carries me away. And I would have long conversations. I think I wrote about this in the acknowledgments. I'm not sure how much I edited it out, but my friend Colby Truesdale, who's Colby, you're awesome if you're listening to this. And you know I love you. Okay, but we would share long commutes to seminary, and we both went to Eternity Bible College separate times. I took a little break between when I graduated and when I started seminary, but we started seminary at the same time. And one of the things we were trying to do is just pay attention to scripture, like make these observations, like what's there, what's not there, look for emphases, repetitions, patterns. And we would have these conversations about atonement, just in general, and that language. And I just started getting bugged that doesn't show up in the New Testament. Like I've read it a bunch of times because of my training and studies, and there's just it's very rare. Atonement language doesn't show. I'm like, so why do we use it? Like, I don't understand what's going on here. And then, I'm studying Acts and noticing, why don't they ever give us a theory of atonement? And why don't they use this language of a sacrifice or a kippur? And what's going on there? If this is the gospel, like why? And again, my context, evangelicalism, the gospel is penal substitutionary atonement and all the framing that goes on. Like that is the message. You believe that theory, and boom. Or maybe in some other Protestant variations, maybe it's not so much on penal substitutionary atonement, but justification by faith. Right. And so you have folks like N.T. Wright, who is, for all the caveats I would say about his work now as a scholar and stuff myself, but whatever, one of the things he helped me do, but just related to this thing of justification by faith, was noticing how rare it is in Paul's letters. Like this actually isn't Paul's gospel proper. This is actually a very contingent set of language and vocabulary he's using for particular circumstances in only a few letters. Important? Yes. Is it what Paul filled it? Like if he has his gospel suitcase, what's he filling it up with? He doesn't usually use the language of justification when he's defining and filling the content of gospel. And so it's noticing and seeing scholars do that sort of work of just attending to what actually is there and is not there, especially when we use language very common and we think it's in places when it's not. So just being careful to nuance those things. Well, now you apply that to language of sacrifice and atonement, and you go, oh, it's the same story all over again. We're importing sacrifice, language of atonement, anytime you see blood, anytime you see forgiveness or whatever. And it's that is it's just irresponsible historically, exegetically, because this happens from scholars, and I'm sure I have these same exact blind spots on other areas. So it's kind of doing things bit by bit, just uncovering, right. Trying to attend to the scriptures, right? So this is how I got on. It just couldn't get away from it. And I was like, why is this language? We use it more often than it comes up in the actual text we have. Why? And then you start digging into that more, and just things kind of, you just keep finding more gems and that leads to other things. So, like in Acts, like I said, there's nothing about this going on in the gospel speeches in Acts. So at first I was like, well, whatever we think about that, it's just not the gospel. Right? It's something else. It's a mature teaching. So I get into this when we get to Hebrews stuff too, because that was a thing that stuck with me way back when. It's whatever we're doing when we're starting to talk about actual atonement, sacrificial atonement, whatever that is, it's not the message itself of the gospel, not the content. Doesn't mean it's not important. And then it came about through teaching. So I had the kind of these kind of more basic, I'd say, observations. But then as I was teaching New Testament survey, and I'd make these sorts of observations, we go through Acts, I'd have them look at the speeches, I'd have them tell me what's here, what's not here, etc. Getting them to see themselves the same things that was annoying me earlier, but without telling, you just kind of lead them, right? You just, hey, read these speeches, summarize this speech, summarize that one, and what's in common, etc. How do they talk about Jesus' death versus his resurrection? Okay, so then students, they'll have more right, they're curious. They're like, okay, what the heck did you just point me to? What does this mean for this? What does this mean for that? And so, this is how I think there's a reciprocal relationship with teachers and students, ideally, I hope. And so for me, it was yeah, so then I'll chase down your questions. All right. So it was responding to their questions and the work I was doing to give resources to my students. So now I'm reading Jacob Milgram and reading all this other stuff and going, wait a minute, there's more to this than even I knew, right? Because I'm chasing down their questions and trying to help facilitate their further learning and extra learning. So I owe it a lot to my curious students that were seeking, following their curiosity and leaning on me as one who can navigate the literature and stuff like that with them. And so that's how it happened. It kind of just happened very slowly. And because it happened slowly, I was able to, over those years, just amass a breadth, I think, of just kind of be able to meditate on it for a while and what these implications are, and kind of connect the dots a little bit better. Or I don't know if better is the right word, but just connect the dots that I think have not been as connected. And there's definitely, as I show in the book, there's New Testament scholars that are connecting dots elsewhere. And that's what I was discovering, and just kind of trying to put more of these dots together. So yeah, it's quite fun.
How long did it take you to write Lamb of the Free? Just curious.
So the actual like sitting down, outline it, write it, I wrote that over 2 summers mainly. So last summer 23 and summer 22. So I got the book contract before that. I had, notes and various things. I wrote up a fairly lengthy document that I think I write about in the acknowledgments for one of my classes. Just like here's some basics of sacrifice and how some implications of the New Testament. It was pretty hefty somewhere. I forget. I have it somewhere, and I wrote it in there. So it's like 14,000 words or something like that. So that was like the only thing I had like written before. And then I got hired so I had to finish my dissertation. So a lot of this was happening during COVID too, to these questions. And so then I had to finish my dissertation because, funding runs out and you want to graduate. And I didn't want to be full-time faculty while still having a lagging defense happening. So I finished that, and then started working at King's in 2021 in the fall, and had a full slate of classes. It was it's really hard for me to write during the school year. So that was kind of stressful. And I write well under stress, I guess, because when the summer starts, I'm like, all right, it's go time. So I just blasted through and wrote most of it that first summer. And then like the last 30,000 words or so in May and June last summer, sent in the manuscript. And then sometime in June of last summer, and breathed a sigh of relief, and then started the editing process once all that stuff happened. Yeah.
Awesome.
So
I love hearing how, I think we feel similarly about another theologian, Andrew Lindsay. The fact that you have found a home where you can have the freedom to explore what you want to explore and say what you want to say. That's so great. But we are curious, like, what kind of feedback have you gotten so far from this book, and what kind of resistance, if any, have you received?
Well, I think okay. So thankfully, it's all been positive to me. Someone, I'm gonna forget his YouTube channel. Someone did like a half hour, maybe 20-minute, like really good flowing review of it on their YouTube channel. Just like a review of theological books. What's his name? Sorry, I think his name. I don't want to get it wrong. Plug that into YouTube. I don't think there's many reviews on it, and you'll probably get it if you're listening and curious. And they tell you not to do this. Don't look at comments. Well, I couldn't help myself because I'm a noob, and I'm like, I wonder what these comments are, and they're very positive. But of course, there's some of them that just write things off. Just the very idea of it. Right. So I don't want to say that there's no one that doesn't like it or something like that. But the people who take the time to write reviews, either through like big outlets like Commonweal, there was a review published recently with that magazine, and it's been very, very positive. I'm sure folks are going to have issues with it. For me, so on the scholarly kind of academic aspect of it, it's received the validation. Not that like people are going to sign off on 100% of what I'm saying. There's this sounds so like elitist, and I don't mean it to, but it's just like, I know people are not going to like it,
right,
for whatever sorts of reasons, but the people whose disagreements I care about
yeah,
are those that have the same sort of contextual knowledge I do, if that makes sense. Like when they have something to say, and I know where those differences are, and those differences aren't defeating the main thesis at all. So I'll give you an example. Madison Pierce, who's a New Testament scholar and recommended and endorsed the book. We have a different reading of Hebrews 13 and the altar there. But that's a very minor point relative to the whole thing. And she's like She then asked me to review an article she just recently drafting now, just a couple months ago, that's using my book, and she's having her own take. Like, so there's like those differences, right? That are like it's not about the whole thing. It's like some of the
Yeah.
more nitty gritty that like even if it ends up that people are more convinced with her take on what's going on in Hebrews 13 there, it's not like anything that is going to take down the main points there, right? And there's a lot that we agree with on Hebrews in particular. So there's going to be those kinds of disagreements, but they all have affirmed and liked the book, if that makes sense. So it's like the affirmation I want as a professional has happened. So negative things, it just depends who's saying it, if that makes sense, right? So I don't mean to say, yeah, I hope that like
No,
it's
no.
past its like scholarly muster, if that makes sense.
Muster,
And as you
yeah.
know, in scholarship, it's not that doesn't mean that everyone disagrees. So I don't want to put out there that like flip any page in Lamb of the Free and bam, that's now the thing that
No, right.
people like no. But the scholarly conversation is such that you're adding things to the table of like what needs to be relevant to this discussion. When someone has something new or a disagreement, it often is saying there's this other bit of information that hasn't been a part of the discussion. So when we
Right.
plop that onto the table, here's how it kind of maneuvers things. Or we're saying, oh, this piece of evidence has been given too prominent a place, and it's actually a bit more relativized than
Right.
that. So like our nuanced scholarly disagreements are just like they're very nuanced, but at the same time, we agree on what should be on the table. Does that make sense?
Right.
Right.
No,
And so the
100%.
folks
Yeah.
that are going to disagree with it are kind of people, that I know of from my like types of people that I've encountered in my own passing and teaching that are just their prior commitments, right? They're just predisposed to not like it. I mean, thankfully, in terms of like I'm a human, so I would you try not to care what people think.
Right.
I'm sure it would like I don't want to say I would be unbothered if folks don't like it, but I expected a lot of resistance, and the fact that it hasn't happened yet is I don't know what to do with that, but it just maybe it's too early to tell. But a lot of people have read it. A lot of people have reached out and written reviews, and I'm just thankful that
Yeah.
it's people are changing their minds. It's not just people who are or would be predisposed to like it.
Right.
I've heard from a number of folks who've like, oh, you changed my mind on these. Like yeah, it was persuasive and the evidence was good. So, yeah, I'm very delighted by that. Almost scared, like I said, like, oh, maybe I should quit. Like, I don't even know. I don't want to put out anything else now,
Right.
because who
Well,
knows
no,
if I, who knows
100%.
No,
what's
you
going to
have to
happen
keep
next.
going.
No, 100%, 100%. No, and like I agree with you. Like I know like Douglas Campbell, he kind of pushed the envelope with Romans, and not everyone might agree with him, but he helped the debate. And Moffat's new book, helping us understand, where atonement might happen. But also, I agree with everything you're saying. And I think, the totality of your argument, I think is huge. I think, yeah, you can try to pick this or that, but when you look at the big scheme of things, if anyone would read this book and just get the whole totality of the argument, it's too big. And I think one of the biggest things you mentioned, it's interesting when we talk, I'll just throw this in because I know time is getting away from us, but like when you talk about the substitutionary aspect, like if Christ's death is substitutionary, then his resurrection should also be substitutionary, right? But we don't believe that. So, you know what I mean? Like there's a contradiction,
Hmm.
right? So
That was such a
that
great
was
point.
huge, I thought. Yeah.
Oh my
That's
goodness.
just one example, but I've been curious about this question. Jacob Milgram, his book, his Levitical commentaries, I don't know. They
Yeah.
seem to me, based on reading your book and some of these others, right, that all this scholarship is coming out as a result of it. It seems to me like his commentary is a bit of a game changer. Is that how you see it? Like you read them and you're like, oh my gosh, like this, we're reading this wrong. Like, just can you talk about Milgram's Levitical commentaries and if they were a game changer?
So I think, well, yeah, anyone who reads my book will just look at the footnotes and how much Milgram comes up. And I try to deal with people who have, well, yeah, this is why you're trying to hit both audiences. There's some sections in there that is basically me talking to a few scholars who have tried to say Milgram framework fails for these reasons. And I'm like, no, it does not fail. Here's other reasons, right? So to address it, right? Because I can't just say, oh, here's Milgram when I know that there's other people that have criticized those views for X, Y, Z. Well, then now I have to address them now that that's on the table, right? So I think it's a game changer for those who now also, is this fair? I don't know. the folks that have disagreed with Milgram's like larger frame, some of the ones that I've responded to in the book, I don't need to name them here out loud, just a little treat for those who actually read it. It's a lot of apologetics motivated, I think. You're trying to hold on to a certain view of Jesus' death, and you know it needs to be linked here. So if you let go from Milgram's right on these things, well, then that's going to fudge up how you're talking about Jesus, right? And they don't want to say that out loud because they're also trying to produce scholarship, but knowing who and what they stand for outside, right, of the institutions they teach at, you're like, okay, you're like contractually obligated to uphold penal. This is a real thing. This cut me off from a lot of jobs because I
Totally.
knew the book I was about to write. This was actually my job talk. So I did my job talk was summaries of a lot of the conclusions of what I was doing, and I kind of focused on Paul, but just so that it was clear, like, this is who I am, this is the project I'm about to engage in. I don't want to be moving my family just for a job, and then either have to get not my contract renewed, even though it's tenure track, like they don't need to renew your contract if you're not a good fit, or B, have to be a chameleon and just do something safe and then have to change my whole thing just so that I don't lose my job, right? Unfortunately, there's a lot of folks who they have to sign statements that specify penal substitutionary atonement.
Wow.
This is at a lot of confessional schools, right? So if you're at like a public university or in religious studies stuff, you don't do that. But anyway, so some of the criticisms of Milgram, not all, just some are generated, I think, by apologetic concerns about Jesus' death. And then what makes him a little shaky is, for me, is that like, well, this person wouldn't have a job if they like they'd have to get a new job. And that's lame. I feel bad. Like that is a no good situation to be in, and one that was hard when there's not a lot of jobs, full-time teaching jobs at places, and it's getting increasingly more divisive. So anyways, but still they have substance, right? To their argument, there's things to deal with. So I address those. But I think a lot of people who aren't in those situations, it is a game changer. And there's several New Testament scholars that have taken this to heart. And I should also say, I also critique Milgram at a few points in the book. They're in the footnotes, so you have to read those if you're a nerd like me. I try to hide those, bury those in the footnotes. And I do so with some trepidation because I'm like, well, let's be honest, he knows Milgram's way more knowledgeable than I am about these things. I probably both by internal constitution and the time spent on it, right? So I have some disagreements with him, but I hold those lightly. But I also feel like I need to mention them because that's where I'm at right now. But so I'm not just like a whole Milgram sycophant or something. But
I got you.
anyways, so there's a lot of New Testament scholars though now currently who have taken what Milgram has done and applied it to New Testament scholarship. So these folks are all cited in the book at some point or another, but I'll just name these people, praise them, and read the stuff they're writing. So Matthew Thiessen, Madison Pierce, who I've already mentioned, Logan Williams, Paul Sloan. He's coming out with a book, Jesus and the Law, very soon. I'm very excited about that. Paul Sloan, he teaches in Houston right now. If you look him up, he just if your audience is interested in those sorts of things. Who else am I? David Moffat, I think you mentioned already. Christian Everhart, Scott Schauf. There's a bunch of New Testament scholars now that are applying this to various aspects of the New Testament and getting, it is reshaping the field, I think, of New Testament scholarship. So, yeah.
I have two questions I definitely want to try to get to. I'm not sure which one to do.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so, well, let's start with this one. I think in one of Middleton's books, he has a section called Singing Lies in Church. Like a lot of our theology comes to us because of the songs we sing, right? We know that singing songs is one of the great ways of internalizing information. So I was just wondering, in terms of penal substitutionary atonement, have you come across songs or hymns that maybe we need to rethink the use of because of the theology within them?
Yeah, so, well, Anglican, I'm an Anglican, and so our hymn book, as we're singing, my daughter gets so I can't help but like give her elbow. She's 13 now, so she I can't help but jostle her a little bit, or my wife as there's something that we're singing, and some of these aren't more well known, and I'm terrible with hymn names, but like as it's going along, it's like I don't know about that. Yeah, I'm not. Nope, no thanks.
No.
But so some actually a really it's unfortunate, and folks have changed this hymn already. Oh, what's the name of it? But it's my brain.
We're gonna make
The
you
wrath
sing
of
it
God
then.
was satisfied.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, what is
Till
that?
on the cross of Jesus
In
died, the
Christ
wrath of God.
alone.
In Christ alone.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Almost all of it.
Yeah.
Amazing. I love it. I just the way it actually moves me the whole bit. But no, I don't. That line is wrong for a few reasons. So folks have changed that already. I forget the iterations of how people have changed it, but I've seen some clever, like the love of God was magnified. I think I've seen.
Okay.
Till on the cross, the love of God was magnified.
I like
Um,
that.
Magnified. Interesting.
what is it? There's been a couple other iterations that are similar, but like where they just substitute that line. The Jesus paid it all. That's depends on what you like. It depends on how it's being understood by the singers.
Hmm.
The whole rant. This is one of the points I make, and you mentioned it. So in real time, for the listener, this is after the chapter 5 summary discussion. And y'all have mentioned that with the ransom bit and forgiveness, and how someone was saying also like, well, forgiveness is you paying the cost of the thing. Yeah. So depend like there is ransom's clearly a biblical word. It's used, right? But it's just kind of attending to, well, who's being paid off or what's being paid off and why. And I think it's based on the paradigm of Exodus, and no one's being paid off there. It's a way of getting at you were enslaved, now you're not. You were in these conditions, and now you're not. So the payment, right, is so if you think, I don't know, let's use a semi-drastic analogy here. So a relationship, married, I don't know, whatever, but it's all going great. Guys are everything's happy. Yay, you're together. There's no cost to that relationship when things are going well, in the sense of like, yeah, you're vibing, you guys are together. As soon as there's harm done, though, it's not really like you'll go, I'll take, like, either way, there has to be a payment all of a sudden now to repair it. But yes, can you metaphorically talk about the forgiveness of the harmed party toward the one who did the harm as absorbing the wrong, like the harm, right? Paying the cost, right, to repair. Sure, but is that also the most apt way of thinking about it? Like, I'm not sure, because that, as if there was like already like a bank account. Like, I don't think the metaphor is helpful when we're talking about relationships and repair. And so the language of ransom and payment
Mm.
in the New Testament or in the Bible is all about enslavement and freedom, right? So when you're in those metaphors, like, what are you enslaved to? And then now you're out. So you're enslaved to Pharaoh, or you're enslaved to sin and death.
Mm.
And the forgiveness there isn't a payment due that is happening when it's God rescuing us from sin and death. And when it's God moving toward us, like in one sense, you could say, yeah, it cost Jesus his life. Well, in the same way, like I said, I'm not sure we should be construing that in hard financial terms,
Yeah.
that like it could have then been remitted in some other fashion, right? No, there's nothing that would have actually remitted and enabled a relationship to repair. And it just so happened that it was Jesus who did it in this way. It's like, no, the only way this was gonna, right? So that's not really anymore like that. That's the liability of some metaphors. They have their limits. So things like Jesus paid it all. Just depends how you're framing that. What exactly are you meaning about with that line? So those might be some ones that I would want to clarify. But this happens a lot on the when we're singing, and I'm like, there's some things that are give the little elbow nudge of like, hey, are you paying attention? Also, maybe we're going to talk about this in the car ride home or whatever type of a thing. Like, I'm gonna so.
Yep. Our church still uses in Christ alone, and they haven't changed the language. And that line is kind of a climactic line musically, that the wrath
Mhm.
of God, it's like
Yeah.
it's kind of like this focal point of the song. So yeah, it's definitely become increasingly uncomfortable for me. And I love what I've heard you say maybe in another context, that this idea that it's the wrath of God, and then the second person of the Trinity is like, oh, I'll take care of it. It creates this weird dysfunctional view of God, that one member of the Trinity is all about, I demand payment and I want punishment. We need to, and then the other person of the Trinity is saying, oh, I'll I'll take care of it.
Hmm.
It is very confusing to the believer. So yeah, I found your presentation of all of that just so refreshing, and so I'm just going to use the word healing, to know it's God who's actually the rescuer. It's God who's the
Hmm. Hmm.
deliverer. Yeah, so thank you for that so
And
much.
he's delivering us from sin and death, right? Like not from himself. And the way the wrath, that's why, I will tease this, it's going to be several years out, but this is why I do want to get into what's the wrath of God in the New Testament or in the Bible, and particularly in the New Testament, how that works out. Because just like with any anthropomorphic thing that we ascribe to God, it's always going to have a measure, an interval, a gap of an analogy. Our language is going to fall short. And this is why a lot of early Christians adopted what was known as like apophatic theology. It's negative theology. Like it's less about your affirmations because our words fall short about what God is. Like it's just God is not this sort of stuff. So it's negative. So you can more
Mm,
properly talk about what God is not than what God is, because our is only known to us in the creaturely realm, and all those concepts are going to fall infinitely short, right, of the infinite God. So, but there is something about wrath and curse, and it's just how those are framed. So there is curse in that's the language, blessing and curse, and how those interact, and how they're not asymmetrical destinies. In fact, when you look at the Torah, it's the curse. It's not like either blessing or curse. That's it. Game over. You pick one. Oh, that was your choice. Done. It's not. The curse somehow is even subservient to God's bringing of ultimate blessing. Blessing's always final. So that's always the ultimate thing. Curse, wrath, judgment's always penultimate, second to last. And somehow, in God's way of making it such that our own worst tendencies, actions, feelings
mm,
cannot sever, to use now Paul's language in Romans 8, the love of God. It cannot separate us. And so, whatever we mean by God's wrath, it cannot be something that's antithetical to his love and to his union and to his movement toward us. Whatever we're trying to get at with our human language of, there are deep, deathly, disturbing, just painful consequences to sin and to our own wickedness at times. However small those moments are, they have devastating consequences. And a way of naming that and talking about God's wrath, then, the naming it as God's wrath, it cannot ever be unhitched from this larger story of God's mission and desire to heal and reconcile and love and redeem and actually make real the creatures that he made, right? To establish us and not let our own worst tendencies break us down into nothingness, break us down and drag us back down into that chaos of Genesis 1:1 of tohu vavohu. So I get the Hebrew. How is it?
formless and void.
Muck and formless and void. Oh my gosh, I got Leanne Feldman's translation in my head. I think it's like muck and mire and wild and waste.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
Disorderliness. That somehow those consequences, right, are then the prophets use to say, like, this is God's wrath. Like when you do these things, life is terrible, not just for you, but for everyone else. And it has cascading effects. But it's never one or the other, right? In the whole story of the covenant story, it's always not just that God will toggle to the blessing bit. It's that somehow even what we perceive as those sufferings, they cannot separate us from God's love. Crucifixion of Jesus, right? What any more example, as Paul says, of like miscarriage of justice in the cosmos? Yet God takes that and makes it the means of his taking on all that suffering. So it's not God allowing suffering of others, but how can God take all that in? Take it in such a way that it will not snuff out his creative work, which is making the universe, not just humans. So anyways, the wrath of God, my goodness, huge topic. My next rabbit hole that I want to go into after I do this dissertation, but or revise it and publish that, which wrath of God plays a pretty big part in that argument.
So
yeah, I just
yeah, no, that's
go on.
amazing.
Sorry. Yeah,
No,
you
No,
got me. You got me a
love
little not you. I should blame myself. I got myself preaching a little bit over there.
I
So
was hoping to do that because I mean, yeah, it's so inspirational. It's so beautiful.
well, I feel like we're running out of time. So do you have another question or I mean,
Yes.
well,
I'm so
I'm good.
looking
I'm
forward
I'm
to
good. We're on a roll here. Might as well keep
I
it
just okay.
keep,
Go
keep the
ahead.
wave running a little bit.
Okay. Okay, well, we would be angry with ourselves if we didn't bring a little bit of a vegan question
Sure.
into
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
mix.
Yes.
There we
Yeah.
go. No.
All right. Actually, I'm out of time. No, I'm just kidding. I'm totally kidding. No. Yeah.
Um, okay, so we loved how you didn't just mention it once, but you came back to it again and again and again, that in Leviticus 17, it's very clear that in God's eyes, the killing of an animal is murder. It's bloodshed. It's, unless it's done with this ritualistic, proper way, that God sees it as murder. So, yeah, I was just wondering, like, how do you think through that? And does that fact, does that have implications for Christians today in how we view non-human animals?
Absolutely. I think there's several things going on here, and just like my joke about I'm out of time. So I'm not vegan, but let me start it this way. I don't think you need, you two in particular. I don't think you need, or vegans, I guess. You don't need to anchor this in anything other than Genesis 1 and something like Isaiah 11. People unfamiliar with Isaiah 11, where basically even all the predatory animals in the reign of Messiah go back to how Genesis 1, just eating straw and grass and stuff and hay. So what that is a testimony to, although, yeah, I think it's made me a bit more vegetarian. I'm unclear on some of the distinctions there between, I know vegans like animal products in general, but like I'm land flowing with milk and honey. I don't know, you get milk there, but okay. These statements in scripture that then the sacrificial system affirms in its own way, because it's trying to take seriously that the consumption of meat, so animals, which depends on the death of an animal, is problematic. It's a problem. It's a marker of a creation that has not yet reached its fullness, right? What God wants. So, but just from those two bits of Genesis 1, Isaiah 11 about the new creation, it's a testimony to a way of, like, a creation that does not depend on death for temporal sustenance, right? And so what it exposes, what it reveals, is that the earth, the universe that we inhabit right now, is one that is enslaved to death. And yet we're proclaiming the freedom, eventual ultimate freedom from that. And that's not just a human immortality. It is a whole creation and the web of relationships within all creation that is released from death, which is why in Romans 8, Paul talks about it's all creation that cannot wait for the resurrection of humanity as the ones appointed by God to rule and govern over all things. Genesis 1, Psalm 8, and other similar texts. The creation can't wait because it's subjected to this futility, right? And decay. So I'll just say that up front, like, I think, yeah, it's just there in our scriptures that what we're hoping for, the ideal creation, is the one in which death has no place. And how death isn't just something of humans growing old and dying, but death is the way our bodies right now, which do die, stave off death for a bit. It is whether that's death of even plant life and things like that, and the cells involved in there and all that, we are just biologically enmeshed in mortality. Okay, that was a long way of saying. That's why I fully have sympathy with that. But then what I think ought to happen is I think Christians, we'll just keep to Christians because we have these sacred texts, and I don't want to over speak my pontificate to other communities. I think Christians at the very least need to be very uncomfortable with how modern society has seduced us into being completely detached from our food systems. And we do not need to exercise the same sort of mindfulness that most cultures of most of human history have had to be attentive to and confronted with, which is, when you're consuming meat, it got there from that goat, from that lamb, from that cow, from that bull, and their milk, even land flowing with milk and honey and all that. So we need to at least be very we should be uncomfortable with Wendy's, with McDonald's, and those types of things. And I think what that will hopefully generate is not just to be as mindful of what we're eating and how it came to our table, but to realize, as I talk to my students, we have a theology of creation course. And one of the things we go into, though, is how our basic food systems that we have, the way our modern society is built and structured, is escaping those food systems is only really realistically attainable for a small fraction of humanity who have sufficient time, money, and or knowledge to sustain themselves apart from these regular food systems and that's not just so the knowledge there isn't just how are you farming or whatever, but also just being aware even of the problems, right? So it's just kind of blanketed over our whole era. And one of the mistakes I think that we can do as Christians is to adopt an individualistic consumer mentality for everything and think the solution, like going green, it's buying into Pepsi's advertisements. It's oh, it's just on you and your choice. And the way they kind of throw green advertisements that make it as if, well, no, don't gaslight us. It's you corporations that are polluting our rivers and stuff, and how this is all there. It's really hard as humans to escape these things. And that's one of, I think, the markers of our should be a source of lament for Christians, is realizing that it's going to be very difficult unless you establish a sort of community. So I think of to use an analogy with Jewish culture, living in just a kashrut, let alone anything else. You need a whole community like that who's going to source and make sure everything is kosher and what you're eating. It's really hard to do that as an individual. It's really hard to be Torah observant as an individual. And as things keep progressing, this is why, they have their communities and to the various ways that they've defined Torah observance in different, Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, etc., and what have you. And that's just an analogy to say, let alone something like being vegan or vegetarian, it's something that becomes more attainable when it's a community organizing around that, because there are the costs there that we can't. So I'm thinking we can't just expect that it's just about individual choices. That's what I'm trying to say. And then how you detach yourself from the pervasive systems of death and overconsumption and destruction that are here is very, very difficult, right? But we need to have that vision before us, I believe. We need to be, I think, consuming our food differently. So folks that have done a lot of, or I'll just name Norman Wiersbe, when Wendell Berry's an English, Christian English and a poet. Yeah. Just for starters, Ellen Davis, food culture, agriculture, Old Testament scholar. I'll stop there. Norman Wiersbe, Wendell Berry, Ellen Davis. I'd suggest folks kind of get into some of their works, but when we're consuming meat, I think it needs to be undertaken with a lot more reverence and responsibility. And it's okay to be uncomfortable. And not just okay, I think being an attentive Christian demands, at the very least, taking a bit more stock about what's happening with how we're consuming and how things come to our table. And so any step toward that, I think, is great, from less meat consumption to the whole spectrum. But then you think about these cultures, like I said, where they've been confronted with this, they've always had, and Israel's one of them, had rituals of reverence and thanksgiving, because whatever's going on, there needs to be, it's almost like a kind of confession / lament that like we are in a world, we are in circumstances in which we are engaging in an action that is less than ideal. To put, the Genesis 1, Isaiah, that is not what it ought to be. And we have to have ways of naming that and sitting with it. And we can go as drastic as like, so you mentioned nonviolent stuff. There's a great article by Philip Porter called, it's online. I'm dropping the name, Penance and Confession and Going to War. Oh, I should have this handy. But basically he says like I'm pacifist nonviolence, but I don't want to make that a condition for full faithfulness, and anyone who isn't is not a Christian or is whatever. But there is what I like about Philip Porter's article there is he talks about the need for
Is it called
confession.
War and Penance? War and Penance?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. Did you? Yeah. Yeah. So he talks about the need of confession and repentance. Anytime blood is shed, even if you go by the just war theory and things like that for other people, the assumption is whenever there's killing, something deeply wrong has happened. Even if it's not the sort of thing that's like it's a murder and you're liable for those sorts of things, but like there's a brokenness there that if those who have been in and shared in and participated in war, you cannot glamorize it and heroize them. And that's one way of dealing with the guilt, right? And he's like, no, not for Christians. You need to say what just happened was a tragedy. And so translate that into, how we're consuming our food and stuff. And those that are unable to have this lifestyle in whatever context they're in or to whatever extent, I do think it needs to be something that is undertaken with a lot more reverence and responsibility like that. Like I said, almost like a lament of that what's happening is not what ought to be. We are somehow falling short of the ideal. There's several examples like this in scripture of that happening. So for like being married, I'm not in the ideal according to Jesus, right? It's fine. It's okay. But that's for this creation only. It is not, we are in the accommodation phase of life. And so like Jesus is eating Passover lamb. He has fish after he's resurrected. Paul's sacrificing in Acts 21, 21? Is it 21? But, and he's actually paying for other folks as well. Like there's things going on that there's several, like sometimes we engage in something that is less than ideal. And we need to tell the truth about that, is basically what I'm saying. We need to not try to then glamorize it the way people like, oh, everyone's a hero, right? And neither demonize it the other way. And so like you're a soldier, like you deserve all the suffering, whatever that happens, or go some other way. And in fact, actually, sorry, it's a tangent, but like one of the most like active people I know for like veteran services is Aaron Defoe Hunter from Fuller, who's also a pacifist, but because it's a lie that the U.S. puts out for the most part, how like, oh, these are our heroes, and we throw someone up at a hockey game or baseball or whatever, and we don't actually treat them well at all with the kinds of things they've done and they're being asked to do. And it's not okay to then just make them some like hero or whatever. But it's also not okay to be like, well, I'm a pacifist, so I don't like, these are my enemies or something. No, they're human and we need to deal with them humanly and attend to their needs. And so Philip Porter's article, I think, as that's important for itself, but as an analogous situation for, I think, food, I think it's just as important as you said, like the lines you're drawing there because Leviticus 17, it is already a concession in Genesis 9, eating meat. And then so it being regulated in Israel's system the way it is, it also reduces meat consumption because it's not going to happen as often. But when it does, it's going to go through these protocols that make you aware of what you're doing. And that, I think, is itself like sometimes maybe the best we can do in an unideal creation when we are not yet resurrected, when we are still all groaning in agony. So you have some Psalms talking about, even praising God for predation, right? The lion cries out and comes its prey. And to realize, well, that's sitting right next to other Psalm, like Psalm 8 or Isaiah 11, where like it's like qualified then because it's saying, well, sure, yeah, the lion can exist and be itself, but that's not yet what God really wants for that creature and for the other creatures. And if we're not constantly having that before our minds, then we won't have motive to change how we're getting our food systems, right? To actually work to say, we need to make this more just. Sure, it's convenient, but convenient has led to so much suffering and abuses and waste and just horror for so much of creation. We need to harness, rein this in. We need to be, we cannot bring the resurrection. We cannot bring that escape from our mortality, escape from creation that's enslaved to death, because that's the work of God, but we can announce it and we can witness to it. And part of our witness, I think, is a lament and is a taking more seriously. Yeah, I think I'm repeating myself now. Sorry, but yes.
No, no, no.
So we need to be truthful with what we're doing and not over glamorize it, neither demonize one way or the other, right? So Paul deals with this. Maybe this would be the easier. Paul deals with consuming meat, you're right, in two of his letters. And I think there's some analogies there. I was both directly applicable and some analogous reasoning that he uses there of how to handle different states of our conscience. Yeah, when it comes to what we're eating, that is very important. When we're eating, this is what's been detached from Western culture. How we eat and who we eat with is a very intimate event. And we've totally just detached that in modern society. It's just like a way, oh, did you go to this nice steakhouse or something? Like it's like for your anniversary, it's like a status thing in that sense of cuisine and not like what you are sharing in. So part of Paul's the whole reason they're having a controversy about this meat consumption, even wine, actually, is what is it sharing in? What are you participating in when you consume that thing? And how does that matter of where it came from and what you are sharing in and with others? And we've kind of lost that participatory element, I think, because of how it's capitalistic, industrialized convenience. And it's made us, I think, worse creatures for it.
Right.
So
100%.
those are my thoughts.
No,
Sorry.
no, it's fantastic. I feel like we're in agreement with you in so many ways, especially politically, just, the way that the New Testament would critique culture. But I know we're running out of time here. So we have
Now I
some,
actually am a little bit, but well,
I
yeah, we'll
know.
have
So
some, yeah,
we have
we'll land the plane a little bit
well,
smoother than just a hard cutoff.
just for our listeners, we had many more questions we just couldn't get to. So,
Yeah. Well, hopefully there'll be another conversation in the
someday,
future.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, yes. Did you want to
So is
finish?
there any loose end you want to like I don't know something I opened up there that like I said I don't want to just abruptly
Oh,
uh
well, no,
um
like I think I agree with Kevin. I mean, so much of what you said is edifying to us to hear you in many ways validate that we're not insane for caring about things like this. And
oh no, not at all.
Appreciate what you're saying. And I mean, I was just, obviously I have way more questions about the cosmos and if we are new creatures and if Christ has defeated death and if we bring in the concept of stewardship, like from Genesis 1, and now that we don't have to, we can sort of push back against death. So I think in our minds, like being vegan is not just a belief or proclaiming the truth, but we're actually in some ways doing the truth, right? We're not eating death. And so that's just one idea where we think we're actually doing something active, not just proclaiming. But again, I know we have to go. So, but
No, yeah, like I get the so this is like me putting my but I just alluded to the Paul kind of like pastoral how we handle issues of deep conviction when especially when it comes to consuming what we're eating. And we don't want to make it a all or nothing thing. Same thing, like I said, even with something as important to me, as nonviolence or something. Knowing me, knowing when I was writing that, it was for me, it was almost like another type of fundamentalism where I thought anyone now who is in disagreement is like failing to meet a criteria of discipleship. And I just don't think that's actually theologically sustainable anymore. Or as much as I am still a pacifist, and all that, it's how I frame that in terms of what that commits other Christians to. How do we testify to the cruciform, cross-shaped way of Jesus in the world as it is, as we receive it? What do we do with veterans, with soldiers? So things like Philip Porter stuff. Like we have to have ways of living in the uncomfortability of failure, of tragedy that comes not just as individual choice, but from our systems that we are embedded in. The other thing is, like I said, you only need Genesis 1, and I mean, you just need Genesis 1, I guess, and Isaiah 11. The danger of trying to anchoring a vegan theology in, say, like the prophets or Jesus' critique of the priests, which is not the same as critiquing the temple. Critique of priests is not, those aren't the same. It's because it's going to lead into, and has, that move opens the door to anti-Semitism, wittingly or not, because it makes Jewish practice the thing that Jesus is overcoming, and he's not. So like I say, he's eating the Passover lamb. He's eating fish after he's resurrected. Paul's eating Passover. He's sacrificing. They're having the stock phrase of milk and honey. There's these things that are there, and that's not to say that, oh, there, we shouldn't think about it. It's to say, no, that those are, like I said, those nest within, and even that psalm with like the line, with this larger ideal. And so that's instructive, though. Paul knows we've got to be freed from death. Creation's got to be freed from death. Right. So, but when he's giving advice about these meat sacrificed to idols, it presumes meat consumption. Right. So that doesn't then validate, like everything I said, hope is clear. It doesn't validate just, oh, does it eat meat? Like, it's fine. Like, don't worry about it. No, you should. Like, you guys aren't weird for saying, hey, how are we thinking about this as well as we should? We need that. I'm using this kind of also, Stanley Hauerwas talks about singleness and marriage and how it's a witness in various ways, in different capacities. Like singleness is a witness to the church grows, it grows by conversion, by the gospel and conversion, and the Spirit bringing new life. It's not just familial and generational in that sort of way. And so it's a standing witness about what's going on. But you're right, you are participating. You are actively, it is an active form that ought to be, I think, acknowledged as such by others, as how'd you put it? It's not just a witness, but you said like you're actively trying to
Yeah, we're not just
I forgot the phrase.
doing. I said it's
you're doing it. Yeah. So then the other thing is like, all right, well then what about internet services and all the things that go into making our screens and our smartphones? Like how enmeshed. It's not, again, that could lead to apathy. So when I teach Revelation, we talk about all these systems and how we're enmeshed in the economics of the beastly structures of the world. It's like, well, how do we undo ourselves? What are our clothes? Like, where did this all come from? Like,
right.
It gets really hard. And I think it's actually, but it doesn't mean you ignore it. I think it actually, like I said before, it's a source of lament, because you realize, ironically, so much about modern lifestyle, now I'm going to go become a Luddite or something, is only possible because of deep harm to creation. Our food, our technology, our transportation, like it just kind of, and it's overwhelming. The last thing I want to do though is build apathy. So when my students, you want to not just want, I think it's the part of the Christian proclamation of the gospel that there is hope, and the hope is something we can be agents of, like y'all are doing and rightly naming. We are agents. We have agency. God restores our agency, and we can proclaim in our embodied actions the restoration to come, but it's not going to be total. And we cannot tie ourselves into knots being overwhelmed of, okay, I got this slice of creational pie that I got, I'm doing good at, and now this one, and now that, and then it's going to become this weird Pelagian endeavor where if we are not, and or post-millennialism or something, where obviously, I guess people know I don't like those things, but that you're doing it only, it is our work to bring this about. Now we get to share in it, for sure, we proclaim it, but we don't want to frame this in a way that makes it so that it's either debilitating because it just the next domino falls and we can't extract ourselves, right? That's part of the crisis to save us, but we need to lament it, we need to acknowledge it, and we need to do, I think, what we can so far as we are called and able to proclaim this hope that we have, Romans 8, this hope that we are going to be liberated from our subjection to decay and futility. And it's going to be manifested in the body of Christ in various ways. And like Paul says, the one thing we can't do is judge, as is condemn one another for whom Christ died, by their practices and by their conscience. But at the same time, I think what's unique about veganism is that when it comes to what we're eating as human beings, it's right there in Genesis 1 and then Isaiah 11. Like that is the new creation that we are aiming for, is one in which we are not sustained by a creation enmeshed in death to various degrees. Because, yeah, I mean, even y'all with like what makes plant life, right? I don't mean this as flippantly. What makes plant life, and the decay that happens for that, like somehow more or less acceptable than something else, or maybe not even just light, but like, milk or eggs or something like that. That's not depending on the actual like consuming meat. And that's not a flippant thing at all. I don't mean that in that sort of way. I mean it as a way of saying the commitment to being vegan as opposed to vegetarian or pescatarian, all the other things is you are embodying, you are trying in your mortal flesh now to live into a life as free from decay and mortality as possible. And I think that by non-Christian vegans, it should not be looked at as weird. It should not be looked at as like, like fluffy, whatever,
Right.
but as something that like, oh, it's kind of the way, sometimes the medieval, maybe this is a bad analogy, would look at monks as like monks and as like, oh, they're like doing they are approximating a separation from worldly life better than we are. But for real, like it's right there in Genesis 1, it's there in Isaiah. That is, when it comes to eating, it is a commitment that I think is just undeniably right there in the Bible, right? But then the whole apathy thing, right? So where does it stop? How do we have a pastoral response in a way that allows us all to, I can proclaim with our actions to where we're called and in our communities to be agents of this new creation. And then also be aware of we've created not only just our food systems, but I have poor students. I shouldn't just not just but like it's like an unattainable thing for a lot of folks. And so how can we work at getting like these are issues? So yeah, sorry, I'm rambling way too much.
No,
Basically, our Christian discipleship, you're right. I just want to take it out of individual choice and say the problems that veganism rightly names as problems within our creation are not just theological in terms of, ideal creation and where we are embedded in death, but I think it should push us to get better food systems. How do we make it more and more possible? It's not just an individual choice, but how do we get more nourishing food distribution and transportation, let alone the energy costs of all that stuff, and to make it so that we are consuming less meat? Because that's also not, I mean, look at our teeth. Are we really supposed to be, so anyways, like I want to push it into policy and regulations and like some of the way these farms are run, right? And that like we should bear the literal cost of consuming meat. It should be more expensive than it is. And the reason it's not as expensive is because or you're smashing all these chickens together and blowing them up with the steroids and all that, so they can't even stand. Their breasts are huge, and it's like, and that's what brings the cost down. And it's like, so no, if it actually costs what it actually would cost if this was a more normal, and by normal I mean like the way people used to just have chickens and eat, like, right? You couldn't just have a whole bunch because you'd run out of your flock, right? You get time, they got to reproduce, they got to blah, 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 blah. And like that, like even just going back to something like that, we would be consuming so much less meat, right? So the fact that we're able to consume more of it cheaply is because of the devastating. So it's like, we got to fix those things, right? And so I'm all for that.
No, we resonate with everything you're saying. The whole enmeshment piece, the sustainability, I think as good stewards, we need to make choices that are sustainable. But I know we got to go, right? So, we're going to wrap up with anything or?
Oh man, I mean, yeah, we didn't get to nearly everything we wanted to, but thank you so much, Dr. Rillera. So we hope you have a wonderful semester, and we can't wait to read.
Thank you. Thanks. I appreciate you all going through the book just for your audience. Just even that, just the summaries are, I'm very thankful for the work you're all putting into doing that. I hope I'm definitely more attentive and challenged to think about the implications of what I was doing beyond just what my own intentions were, so to speak, which also might say something about hermeneutics and authorial intent. We can be, some things can have implications beyond what we maybe have intended sometimes. But yeah, I'm thankful that you all are able to use it and build on it. So thank you for giving it the time and all the work you put into it.
Oh, absolutely. No, it's a great book. It's changed our lives. And so we appreciate you. We appreciate your work. And we look forward to your future endeavors. So
blessings.